There are so many opportunities that are identified during the liability conversation, and so many opportunities that are passed by because we always take the customer's existing liability coverage and we plug it into the quote and we just get to that price conversation. And when we slow down for a little bit and we have a liability conversation, you'll find more multi-line items in that conversation. So think about it like this. Customer comes in, they want a homeowner's quote. They say, I just want you to quote my homeowners. You start your quoting process, you get to the liability coverage. You have the ability now to engage that customer in a conversation to identify if they have any additional items that you should be aware of, such as boats, motorcycles, watercrafts, ATVs. Those are items that are all assets that if that customer gets in an accident, those assets are exposed. Even though the customer didn't want to quote on those items, you still have an obligation to know that they exist. That liability conversation exposes those cross-sell opportunities, maybe not today, but in the future. Also having a liability conversation, things like secondary properties. Even though your customer is getting their primary home insured from your agency, you really have to identify if they have any additional properties because those are assets that could be exposed in a liability conversation. So having the right liability conversation is going to expose all of your sales opportunities in that multi-line agency, and that's why it's so important. And not to mention, having this conversation always leads into the life insurance part of the protection, right? That asset, that home, that secondary home, if they carry mortgage balances, if they have children in the household as far as protecting young drivers, those are signals that that's a life insurance prospect, right? So having the right conversation, liability, is going to result in a lot of P&C cross-sell opportunities as well as life and retirement. The personal umbrella policy conversation is the most underutilized, least talked about conversation in a multi-line agency. Why? Because we don't have liability conversations with every single customer. We assume the existing liability limit is just going to be just perfect. Once we truly start digging into a customer's household and we identify equity in the home, additional vehicles, additional P&C items, those are all assets that start to add up. Before you know it, you're talking about a personal umbrella policy because it's always more efficient maybe for the customer to have that umbrella protection than just have normal liability exposures. But to get to that conversation, you really got to dive in and understand who that customer is. There's a lot of opportunities by identifying who that customer is during the liability conversation. If a customer just wants a motorcycle quote from the agency, being inside of an agency office or a multi-line office, you still have the liability conversation with every single item that multi-line agency provides. Liability attaches to everything inside of the property and casualty world. So yes, you definitely have a conversation about the liability with a single line like a motorcycle. The beautiful thing about just identifying the motorcycle and talking about their liability coverage is that now you have the opportunity to identify all of the other cross-sell opportunities inside of the household, because now having that liability conversation exposes the additional properties, the additional vehicles, the life insurance owned, the retirement products that are inside the household, the asset values that you're trying to accumulate, to really understand that if this customer gets into an accident because they're riding their motorcycle on the road and they hurt somebody and they get sued, just because they're on a motorcycle doesn't mean we shouldn't have had the liability conversation. They always need to be protected, so always have that conversation. When a customer walks into a multi-line agency and they just want to quote on their motorcycle insurance, I talk about the liability exposure once I turn around and I see what their existing liability limits are on that motorcycle. If they're just purchasing a motorcycle, I'm going to ask them, what type of liability limits do you think we should have on this policy? And then they're going to say, what's liability? Because we know 95% of the customers have no idea what liability is, and that's always the intro to having that discussion. So once we identify the liability, I say, this is an important part of the policy. What we're going to do is we're going to ask you a few questions to identify what this number should be to protect you in case you ever get into an accident as far as protecting your household assets. So I use a language as if I'm identifying it with an existing customer. So if they have an existing motorcycle, they come in through the door, I say to them, you know what, I see that you have existing liability limits of 100, 300 from a protection standpoint. Did your previous insurance agent ever explain to you how liability works? Customer will always say no. Or I turn around and I identify the existing liability coverage and I identify the number and I'll say, hey, you have 100, 300 in your existing liability coverage. This is the most important part of the coverage on this motorcycle policy. It protects your household assets against accidents, lawsuits, and catastrophes. I'm going to step back and I'm going to ask you a couple questions. It'll take about 1.5 to 2 minutes, but it's going to allow me to understand what type of customer you are from a protection standpoint and making sure that your household is properly protected from any lawsuits, accidents, or catastrophes. And when you constantly resonate lawsuit, accidents, or catastrophes, the customer now is engaged because they want to make sure they're properly protected.